Hello, this is Francesca Recchia, and I would like to welcome you to a new episode of the Dispatches series by the Polis Project. A recent investigation by the online magazine Motherboard found that the US Special Operation Command, the command that deals with overseeing counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, and various covert activities worldwide, has been purchasing mobility and location data from several popular mobile applications, including Muslim Pro, an app that is used by around 98 million Muslims around the world. Last week, Amnesty International released a statement questioning France's self appointed role as free speech champion. A quote from the statement reads: "While the right to express opinions or views that may be perceived as offending religious beliefs is strenuously defended, Muslims' freedoms of expression and religion usually receive scant attention in France under the disguise of Republican universalism. In the name of secularism or laïcité, Muslims in France cannot wear religious symbols or dresses in schools or public sector jobs." These are only two of the most recent examples of the double standards that Muslim citizens are constantly faced with the world over. To discuss these and to understand what are the various implications and consequences of such a situation, we have invited today Dr. Azem Qureshi. Thank you so much for being with us today.
No, thank you so much for inviting me.
Dr. Azem Qureshi graduated in law and read for a PhD in international conflict analysis. The focus of his work has been advising legal teams involved in defending terrorism trials in the US and at Guantanamo Bay. He is the research director at the advocacy group CAGE, and he is the author of Rules of the Game, A Virtue of Disobedience, and he edited the recently released amazing book that I super recommend to everyone. I Refuse to Condemn: Resisting Racism in Times of National Security. I really want to start from the book. I want to know how the book came about and why you decided to conceive it as an anthology that features very different voices and perspectives, but also who is the book for? What is the audience that you imagine for such a book?
Sure, and thank you again to all of you, to your whole team. It's really wonderful to be here. I appreciate having the opportunity to speak about these issues. So really, the book came about because Manchester University Press, who are the publishers, they contacted one of their senior editors, saying he wanted a book on citizenship deprivation, which is kind of a new emerging tool that's used by European states to deprive particularly Muslims of their citizenship, to send them back to their supposed countries of origin. But even that is quite questionable. I didn't have another book in me, a full book, because I had just recently finished Virtue Disobedience, and I was quite exhausted from that. But in the back of my mind, I'd always had this idea to bring together an anthology on the experiences of condemnation, largely because it's something that I've been personally affected by myself. You know, it's very personal to me. Back in 2015, I went through probably the most difficult period of my professional life, when I did a number of interviews around a man named Mohammed Emwazi, who I knew, who was a former client of mine, who then went on later in his life to become Jihadi John, the infamous ISIS executioner. So I was routinely condemned by the media, by the highest politicians in our country, including Boris Johnson, David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister at the time, for refusing to condemn ISIS, for refusing to condemn their actions at the request of the people who were interviewing me. And my point at the time was to say that that there is no reason for me to answer your question, because the only reason the question is being asked in the first place is because of my Muslimness, my perceived Muslimness. I would regularly be in interviews with other guests as well who weren't Muslim, and the same questions and the same demand to condemn were never put on them. And the point that I was trying to convey at the time, albeit probably quite badly, but I was insistent on, is that, you know, when you ask us to condemn, you are effectively saying that we do not consider you to be human. We do not consider we do not consider your humanity as being valid until you explicitly state for us that you are worthy of our respect. And, you know, as somebody who's been you know, an activist and a researcher my whole life, you know, I felt that this demand is one that is rooted in racism. And so the book really came together because I knew many of my friends in the different spaces that they occupy, whether as activists or whether as scholars, as academics, they had experienced similar things in different ways, like, you know, speaking on the phone, just talking about these issues generally, you know, as you kind of develop your own relationships with you know, kind of different communities who are oppressed in different ways. I had a feeling that these guys would have a very similar experience. And so when I put forward the idea to Manchester University Press, they said, yeah, sure, you know, bring together, you know, these scholars. And I reached out to many people, and there are so many more people than included in this anthology. Some of them were very scared and reticent to write about this because they felt that they weren't in a strong enough political position to be able to express themselves on this matter. And that's why, you know, there is a lot of bravery in this book to speak about this issue in particular, to speak about how this demand for condemnation is an unfair one. You know, but I think that, you know, what the authors did is that they really brought their truest selves to this. This is not an academic exercise, and this isn't about us trying to prove our case to, you know, predominantly white societies. This book is about us expressing to our own communities how this condemnation demand is made of us, but also showing them a pathway of how we can resist that demand too, and why we should resist that demand for ourselves. Now, if other communities pick up the book and maybe, you know, have some introspection about the way that they might have, you know, asked people to condemn, or even to explain themselves, explain their religion because of the actions of a few, then hopefully that introspection will help to develop you know, more awareness about, you know, kind of how racism manifests itself.
You sort of started hinting to that, but the book confronts this skewed equivalence between refusal to condemn and condoning. The logic being that if a Muslim does not condemn an act of terrorism and the community at large assume to be behind it, it automatically means that she or he either endorses or condones that very act. Could you help us unpack this false equivalence?
Well, I mean, this really goes back to George Bush's very first statements after 9/11, where, you know, he said, you're either, you know, with the terrorists, you know, or you're either with us or with the terrorists, effectively. And that really set a tone for the way in which states engage with their Muslim populations. And, you know, of course, you know, we talk about that, you know, and it's almost impossible to talk about that without talking about the otherizing, even in the way that we speak about Muslims, almost as if they are outside of Europeanness. You know, whereas, you know, people like myself who were born and raised here, there's many people who are now fourth, in some cases even now fifth generation, living in the UK, especially in France, but in other European countries too. And of course, then you have, you know, Europeans who for hundreds of years have been Muslim, like in the Balkans, for example. And so you have this kind of like strange conversation constantly taking place about Muslims, like predominant society and its Muslim population. It's never within the conversation of what it means to be a citizen. You know, it's never a conversation about how the state treats one of its own. It's always about the state in negotiation with, you know, these outsiders, and that in itself is problematic. But then when you add this extra layer of complexity, which is around the condemnation culture, then of course that magnifies that otherness. My colleague at Cage, he actually gave Adnan, he gave testimony to one of our Home Affairs Select Committees. It's a committee that gathers to discuss various issues, to take evidence from civil society and from different organizations. We submit, and they were looking into this issue of extremism and counter-extremism. So we submitted some evidence explaining why we thought that the government's counter-extremism approach was wrong, why it was rooted in bad science, a racialized science in particular. And the select committee, which is made up of politicians, they just used that moment in order to demand of my colleague that he condemn acts of terrorism, and he explain himself about that. And even one of the politicians, you know, in fact, well, pretty much said exactly those words: if you don't condemn it, then it must mean that you condone, right? But they don't understand, you know, kind of why the demand for condemnation hurts us. And I think it's one of the fascinating things about the book. I was very keen that we don't try and prove our case, but it just so happened that, you know, one of my friends, Shanaz Banglawala, she had just finished some research through focus groups and various other kind of data gathering around the issue of condemnation. And so when I was speaking to her about the project, she was like, well, look, I've got all this data, you know, I'd be happy to write it up for the book. And it's actually a really wonderful chapter because she shows essentially one truth about this whole condemnation culture, that condemnation by Muslims does not provide anything more than even like a soupçon of a shift in attitude by those who already suspect us, right? Because the base level of expectation is for Muslims as the other, as being separate, as being unequal, as being dangerous, is so low that even when we condemn, the attitude actually that comes with it is, well, good. It just reinforces what we thought about you all along, rather than what's supposed to happen, right? Like what they're saying to us, and what, you know, certain community leaders who actually do regularly kind of, you know, give themselves up to this condemnation, is that they say, well, that will reduce tension, but it doesn't reduce tension in any way, and the data doesn't support them in any way to that effect. And so, you know, now we see the final manifestation of that with the closure of the CCIF, which is the Collective Against Islamophobia in France. And one of the charges, and the charge against them to justify their closure, the French Home Interior Minister has explicitly stated that it's because, in their mind, CCIF refused to condemn the killing of Samuel Paty, which of course is a nonsense, because CCIF, you know, explicitly, you know, talked about their regret over the incident and whatever else. But this demand for this specific word of condemn is now so ubiquitous in the way in which states treat Muslim communities that, you know, I think it's more necessary than ever to resist that urge to do so.
So in a sense, this idea of condemnation would be some sort of redemption from your own selves.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, I can't remember the name. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the paper, but a group of Americans did a scientific experiment where they did a whole series of videos to, again, focus groups with Muslims saying certain things in order to see whether or not it reduced level of hostility against Muslims. And one of those videos was a condemnation video. And interestingly, that condemnation video was shown to actually increase the level of hostility, because again, it reinforced this idea. I'll try and find the link and share it on your Twitter later, but it's a very interesting paper.
One of the things that I most appreciated about the book is the fact that you do not look at Islamophobia in isolation, but you place it in a wider discourse around racism and its unavoidable interconnections with colonial histories and contemporary imperialism. And I think this is a rare point of view. It's not very common that, because, there is always, in popular discussion, a Muslim problem, but there is never a sort of historicization of what is the root of this situation. Could you help us highlight what are the historical relations that brought to the contemporary standstill in many ways?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I think there are scholars who are doing some really brilliant work around this, and especially within the context of the war on terror, we're drawing those parallels. Like Professor Lale Khalili, Kim Wagner, Priyambada Gopal. They're producing really amazing literature. Nadina Leneni's recent book on bordering Britain, again, superb. I, specifically asked Adam Elliott Cooper to join this collection because I could see some of his work that was already making those connections. So he talks about the 4 stages of moral panic, but what he does is that he links what's going on in terms of condemnation culture with what's happening with, say, for example, drill music. So it's a type of music that's considered excessively violent by, kind of society predominantly. But like with rap music in the early 90s America, it's given this like status as producing violence, that this culture of this type of drill music produces this violence that is taking place. And I wrote some stuff earlier a few years ago about rap music in particular, especially the debates that were happening when police officers were being killed in the early 90s. You had songs by NWA, F the Police, and you had Ice-T's Cop Killer, you had various songs by Tupac that were kind of talking about this culture. So what's interesting about that history is, of course, what was very, very effectively proven was that if it was the music, if it was the culture that was producing this violence, then why weren't white people who were also absorbing this music carrying out this violence too, right, against police officers in particular, if that was the connection that was being made? And of course, the simple answer is that white people were being subjected to police brutality and deprivation and being stigmatized, and all the other ills, the sociological ills that we know of, take place every single day within specific communities. The way that they are otherized, the way that they are oppressed, the way that they are demonized, right? They don't have to deal with all of that baggage. So when we take a backwards look at the way in which certain cultures are condemned, we get an understanding and a sense for the way in which language in particular has this violent effect. And just right now I'm reading a book on the genealogy of terrorism, and you look at the word thug and how it comes out of the context of British colonization of India, and how that word thug then became morphed into terrorism within the Indian context, and then how thug later appears on in contemporary times in the UK, especially in the 1980s, in order to profile and surveil Black communities, how those communities then get not replaced because racism has never gone anywhere, but maybe the specific major spotlight shifted onto Muslims, and then it became about terrorism again, and how that terrorism legislation is now used in order to deal with the supposed Black gang problem that we have, which of course is a nonsense. There's no kind of specific Black gang problem. It's just the way that states construct these things, but now are using counterterrorism legislation to deal with kind of issues that are presented in the media in an overinflated way. And so all of this connects because it's about how states use language. It's about how states otherize communities in order to repress them, but also to quell any dissent to what the state does. This language is extremely important, because if you are outside of humanity and you refuse to play by the predominant society's language and narrative for who you should be, then you are considered a threat. And that's what they want to do. They want to present people like me and others as threats to society.
There's a chapter in the book where discussion about fashion escalates into a discussion about terrorism. So it seems that it's kind of a one-track mind that doesn't allow the discussion to go any further.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Hoda Katabi's experience, like that interview is wild. And again, hopefully we can share the video at another time. But it's so wild because she's there to talk about kind of fashion trends in Tehran. That's what her book was about. That's what she was invited to speak on. And there's a shift that happens in the conversation to immediately like kind of talk about women's rights in after the Islamic Revolution in 1979, and about the forceful wearing of the hijab. But what's interesting about that in particular is that, yeah, that's fine. That's still somewhere within kind of the scope of the conversation. We're talking about clothes, so fine. At least there is some link there, okay? But then when the Hoda very effectively responds and saying, well, why are we reducing conversations about women's rights to like a headpiece? Like why aren't we talking about kind of the excellence of women in various academic spaces and other spaces within Iran? It just shifts then towards nuclear weapons. It's just crazy how quickly it happens, but it just shows you how um, certain societies are deemed dangerous, their people are deemed dangerous. And so, regardless of what the conversation is about, it's so easy for those within positions of power, especially within the media, to just, change the narrative. I've had it happen to many, many times, I'll be talking about one thing to do with due process, extrajudicial killings, torture, and the next thing I know, I'm being quizzed about Sharia law. So this happens, even though I'm not an expert in the Sharia. Fine, I'm a practicing Muslim, but to demand questions and answers to things that scholars are debating, it's something that is really beyond the scope. But it's just an effective tool to do what? To diminish our message. To say, well, you're talking about crimes of the state, so what we'll do is that we'll present you as some kind of extremist by asking you questions about something that has nothing to do with your subject matter expertise. And that's a tool that is very, very effectively deployed all the time. And of course, the majority of the society laps it up, which is why they get away with it.
Mhm. I want to go back to something you touched upon earlier, and I want to use a quote from Sohaima Manzoor Khan. She writes, I refuse to prove, condemn, or apologize according to narrative which rest on the premise that I am not human. Philosophically, the idea of alterity, of radical otherness, passes through a process of dehumanization. The articulation is such that the other is deprived of her or his very humanity, and in a sense almost makes it easier, assuming that this is even a word, to justify prejudice, marginalization, hate, and consequently violence. Can you help us understand what is the logic at play in this devious process?
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously others have written very, very effectively about this. Susan Sontag's got a wonderful book, on this very topic. We're talking about how demonization and barbarization take place. And, we don't have to look very far within our history. You look at the Balkans conflict and the way in which entire community of Bosniak Muslims were demonized constantly and consistently through every single state apparatus that you can think of until a genocide takes place. And we see this in other contexts. We see now people like Bolsonaro using that same tactic in order to demonize, especially those who are darker skinned within Brazil. This tactic it's so normal that it's almost like you know we really don't need to talk about it anymore, but it's still so necessary to talk about at the same time. That's the crazy thing about it. Like, we have so many historical examples. Just look at what happened during the Holocaust. Like, if anybody who studies the history of the Holocaust knows that it was done through a peddling images of of Jews as others. It was done not only in Nazi Germany, but it was done right here in the UK by newspapers like the Daily Mail. Kind of images of rats, for example. And then we have that same images being replicated now in the context of immigrants, you know, of people who are trying to save their lives by coming to these shores. But you see the extent of the dissonance, though, when we talk about, say, for example, white British people traveling abroad to take up economic opportunity because they feel that they've been let down by their own government. Let's look at nurses, for example, who regularly travel to Australia to find more opportunity, or Canada because they get treated better there. Okay, but the narrative isn't, oh, you know, here are people who have been, you know, badly treated by their own government in terms of how they are viewed by the government, you know, how they're not given pay rises, how they're not given any adequate resources, how they have to literally leave their own homes in order to find opportunities elsewhere. But that narrative about them is never presented in a demonized way. Whereas, of course, when other people who are suffering the consequences of foreign wars, of Britain's foreign wars, of America's foreign wars, okay, say to themselves, we can't live in these countries now because our countries are being torn apart, and they flee for their lives, and they come to our shores, and they have lots to bring, lots to give. They're demonized as rats. And so, you know, this is part of a pathology of the way that racism works, you know, particularly within Europe. You know, it's as old as colonization itself. And so, you know, I think that unfortunately, you know, Sahima's poem really gets to the heart of it. And the hardest part of her poem, of course, is that initially, when she started to write that poem for that competition, she was writing a poem that was about justifying her existence, about how she wasn't a terrorist, because this happened right after the London Bridge attacks, you know, and she wanted to kind of make clear that, you know, like, I'm okay, I'm not like that. You can relate to me. I am relatable. I am, you know, all of the things that you are. I don't know how to make the perfect amount of pasta, right? You know, which is one of the lines from the poem. But you know, ultimately, she rejects that, and I think that's why the poem is so powerful, because she acknowledges first and foremost that even for us, and you know, we have this desire to make ourselves acknowledged by power, by the dominant in society, because we just don't want to live these lives where we're constantly having to justify ourselves. And sometimes it's easier to just give up and say, okay, fine, you know, like, whatever, I'm just going to play by your rules. And it might make me miserable, but at least I won't have to deal with being confronted with this racism day in, day out.
Yeah, I want you to tell us a little bit more about this, because it's an immense act of courage and a profoundly political gesture, the one of refusing to condemn. Because obviously it would be, as you said, much easier to say, fine, whatever, this is what you want to hear, this is what I'm going to say, and I move on with my life. But then getting to the resolution of refusal, it's an immensely political act.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a very difficult one to do. Tariq Yunus, Dr. Tariq Yunus, he writes one of the early chapters in the book. And, you know, this, as a person of color, as a Muslim, this chapter in particular breaks you like bit by bit by bit, in ways that you could never have imagined being broken by a piece of writing. Because what he does is he opens up in extremely honest ways about how he feels he wasn't able to resist in various moments, how he complied, like, for example, justifying his humanity to a border agent in America by virtue of having a relationship to, you know, the Canadian police, and being told by the American border agent, well, you know, you should carry that letter with you at all times, as if like, okay, this, you know, this will help give you a pass, and him feeling like initially a sense of relief about that, but recognizing that not everybody has that privilege. Or, you know, being in a stadium full of people after the biggest attack that had taken place against Muslims, where 50 people had been hurt at a mosque in Quebec, and standing there in Quebec at the stadium about to give a speech, wanting to hold politicians to account that are in the crowd for their vitriol, for the language that they used to, to dehumanize Muslims, the very people who were dehumanizing the Muslims that allowed for a space for this attack to take place, were then like trying to show their solidarity. Thoric wants to, he really wants to hold them to account because he's been given a platform. But instead he retreats to a place of safety for everybody, for the whole audience, by trying to bring everyone together. The burden is always on us as the brutalized to do the healing work. And that is a very, very, very hard thing for us to do when we're constantly being brutalized. That we are the ones who are required to heal these rifts in society, that you are racist against us, and we need to make you feel better about your racism because you didn't really mean it, or you didn't mean anything by the things that you said, even though we're losing our lives as a consequence, even though we're losing our jobs as a consequence, even though we are being locked up and detained and profiled at in the hundreds of thousands every single year. And yet we are the ones on whom the burden and the expectations are placed to make everyone else feel better about the roles that they play. And this refusal of the book, and that's really where the word comes from, like, that it's not just a passive thing. What we're saying is that we actively refuse to condemn any longer, because this condemnation has not provided us any solutions. It's not provided us any protection, any support, any care. It's just resulted in this non-stop harm, and if anything, it's reinforced the negative stereotypes about us.
Thank you. I want to borrow for a second Althusser's idea of interpolation, that hey you, that the repressive state apparatuses use it to single out individuals. And if you allow me the wordplay, this is a process that excludes in order to include. Many of the chapters in the book seem to subsume such an idea, where a sort of an essentialization of what Muslimness is supposed to be is often play out in a tokenistic manner to prove inclusiveness. Could you comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think that last section, so the book is split up into 4 different sections about the ways in which, structurally, the contributors exercise refusals. The first section is kind of how we all got here, how we got to this present moment. It talks, we talk about the history of condemnation, about kind of colonization, about the history of racism in this country, particularly in the UK. But then we move into resisting the structures. So how in different places, whether in legal structure, whether it's at airports, wherever it might be, in academia or in universities, right, we resist. Then it was about resisting the personal. That's the 4th area. The final area is about resisting the performance, right? So condemnation is a performative act. It's an act that we play out in various spaces at various times in order to normalize ourselves, in order to make us, like we've said already, more human and available to others. But what's interesting about this performance is that it plays out in different ways, because of the way in which I would say neoliberalism in particular has conditioned us to understand who we are. So Muslimness as an external manifestation So whether it's with the beard, whether it's with your clothing or the hijab or wherever it might be, is tied to a kind of politics of representation that's really about, you know, kind of like how do you fit in with the predominant structures of society, not how are you helping to change society and be subversive and be rebellious and be revolutionary, right? That's not the Muslimness they want. The Muslimness that they want is one that neatly enfolds itself within the seams of society, whatever those seams might be. And predominantly, of course, we know that's capitalism and neoliberalism. So we're absolutely fine with the halal food industry, right? Even if that halal food industry is based on battery farmed chicken, okay, which are, you know, animals that are tortured. We're absolutely fine with a halal fashion industry, providing you don't care about where you resource materials from, providing you're okay with, you know, sweatshops producing that fashion. So again, questioning whether, you know, the halalness of it to begin with. You know, we're absolutely fine with halal finance. So, you know, kind of David Cameron once, you know, praising the fact that Britain had led the way on producing these, you know, kind of Sharia compliant Sukuk bonds. That's good Sharia. It's wealth generating Sharia. It's wealth generating Muslimness, right? And so with its food, finance, fashion, right? These three F's, you find this confluence of enmeshing and assimilating Muslims into a structure and a system of violence that harms lots of other people all over the world every single day. And we know from studies how our lives, particularly those of us who live in Europe and the Western world, are privileged, are built off the backs of third world trade, are built off the backs of underdeveloped trade, of sweatshops, of all of these things, right? That's the good Muslim, right? Now the bad Muslim is the one who refuses to engage in this performance, the one whose message is harmful. So when Suhaima gets invited by the Association of Muslim Police to recite poetry as a woman who wears, as a Muslim woman who wears a hijab, okay, the Association of Muslim Police have not heard one iota of her message. Her message is radical, it's revolutionary. Her message is about holding police brutality to account. It's about you know, justice. It's about developing systems and structures outside of policing. And yet, here they are sending her an invitation to come and speak at their gala dinner, not speak, to recite poetry because, you know, she's a great poet. But the greatness of her poetry isn't just in the brilliance of her verse and her rhyme and her meter and, you know, all the other aspects what that make poetry wonderful. Those are all brilliant, and she's brilliant at utilizing them. But it's also what makes her special. It's her message, which is so unique, and they completely eviscerate that message. You take, for example, another, like, you know, kind of one of the most famous institutes that deal with countering violent extremism, CVE as it's known, and PREVENT as it's more commonly referred to in the UK, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, asking her, you know, who's campaigned against CVE, to be one of their kind of like CVE heroes or activists. And it's like, it's so crazy because, like, have you bothered to engage with her material, of her critique, of the brilliance that she brings every single day in helping to educate us all about the boundaries of these problematic institutions? And that's where the performance comes in. You know, then you see people like Amir Rahman, who's, you know, who says that my art is for my people, that it's not about making other people feel good. I'm not here to demonize Black people and Muslims for the sake of making white people feel happy and comfortable for an hour and a half on a comedy stage, right? That's not what he's about, which is why he's also not as successful as some other comedians are who are willing to engage in the vilification of the communities. And of course, you know, we have Huda Katibi, who we've spoken about already, but, you know, Loki as well, the rapper Loki, who, you know, whose skill as a rapper is very, very, very well known. Like he's spoken about in the annals of UK rap as being, you know, one of the most skillful rappers that there are. why doesn't he have the same platform that others who went down commercialized routes did? The ones who rap about violence, who rap about drugs, who rap about alcohol, who rap about, all of the things that have been commercialized by the music industry. Why is he not afforded the same platform as them? And it's because his message is considered too subversive, and he refuses to perform in order to be relevant. And in that, he is condemned, but he refuses that condemnation in so many profound ways, and which is why that last section is so important, because all of these four individuals, they show us a praxis. They show us how the theory can result in a form of success that, for those people who have a conscience, is satisfying. That success isn't tied to material wealth. It's tied to a notion that they in themselves are satisfied with what they produce, and the people who benefit from their messages are also being educated, are glad, are happy that these people exist to show them a way.
Yeah, this notion of praxis is fundamental at the core of the book, because I mean, we were discussing before starting our live conversation that, one thing that the book brings about is lived experience. It's not a theoretical speculation of what it means to refuse to condemn. And I think you gave us quite a number of examples of lived and embodied experience. Where did your choice come from? Why did you decide to make it so?
I think we have so much academic material now that studies terrorism, extremism, racism, all of these things, right, from a critical perspective. And often it's framed through the kind of the theoretical frameworks of people we're all very, very familiar with now, especially those who are involved in academic studies, whether it's Foucault, Gramsci, or any of these thinkers. I felt like we needed to move beyond that a little bit and center our experiences as a path that's already been laid, that's already been trodden, so that other people can see what that path actually is. It's not, because this book was for our own communities, what we didn't want it to be is, okay, in a high-minded way, here's how you can theorize what's happening. It's, okay, this is how physiologically that incident has left a scar on my body. And it's something that I open up about for the very first time in this book. I've never spoken or written about my own experiences explicitly in public before, and in the opening chapter I take on somebody, I reflect on an interview with somebody that we all regard as being a very decent person, generally speaking. Jon Snow, he's one of the most famous news interviewers that we have and journalists that we have in the UK. Like, he's done phenomenal work. I say that now even as somebody who has a personal grievance with him, that he has produced a phenomenal body of work that has been extremely fair. It's been extremely well regarded over many years. And even now, I wouldn't be ashamed, despite my personal issues, to share something from him if it was fair, because that's the kind of reputation that he's had most of his life. But here I am in 2015. This is what the introduction starts with: being bamboozled by him demanding that I condemn Jihadi John, who I never knew as Jihadi John. It's the person he became later in life. I have subsequently, since that interview, on many occasions apologized for some of the language that I used to describe him, and more so because, as somebody who works with torture survivors, almost every single day of his life, I know how important it is that we're careful in our language for the survivors of trauma. And so, of course, Jihadi John had there were many families who were affected by his actions, and so I should have been more careful about how I described him, and I readily admit to that. I've written about that many times since. Of course, we make mistakes as human beings, and when we're trying to get our political messages across, sometimes, unfortunately, we can get too carried away. But there has never been anything in my life, I would argue, that has warranted somebody asking me whether or not I condemn the beheading of my fellow countrymen. You know, people like Alan Henning, people who it was well known by that stage that Cage had been, you know, directly involved in trying to get Alan Henning released from ISIS custody. That we were, you know, trying our hardest, making appeals. You know, somebody that we admired as an amazing human being who was really trying to help others. And of course, we hurt. And I was trying to express this to Jon Snow, that like I genuinely felt hurt at Alan's killing by Jihadi John. Like I pained for his loss, like many other people pained for his loss as well. And so to ask me to condemn the acts of Jihadi John was so strange, because there was no locus between him and me. Like I'm a critic of ISIS, right? But that wasn't enough for him. He needed to hear from me. And this is what I think we need to ask ourselves. Why was it so necessary? Why was it so important for Jon Snow to hear those words coming out of my mouth? And I think that that's only really something that he could really properly answer, you know. But if we were to take a guess, it's because, you know, white society predominantly has anxiety about Muslims it lives alongside, that they ultimately do not trust us. And that is part of the huge shame of the way that the war on terror has conducted itself. That when we come with messages that are critical of what the mainstream is doing, what the government is doing, we are automatically placed in a box unless we prove and outwardly advocate that we are against this. Now, what happened from that interview, and this is what I really open up about in a major way for the first time, is that it left a physiological scar on me, to the extent that I found it impossible to respond to media requests. I think it was maybe a year and a half before I did any media again. And even then, that was friendly media. But even then, knowing that it was a friendly media interview or whatever, that there was, that my heart rate would raise, because I didn't trust. But Jon Snow was supposed to be friendly. You know, I've done combative interviews before Jon Snow. Like you go into those interviews knowing that there's going to be a degree of hostility, but I never expected it from somebody who was supposed to be fair. And that changed my body's reaction indelibly. So even now, when like we get a media interview request, my heart rate goes up. You know, it starts thumping. I'm not able to control it, because I understand trauma, because I've studied trauma. I understand what's going on. And so I go through an exercise in my mind saying, this is what's happened. You received this email, your heart rate's gone up, you're feeling anxiety because of it. It's because of the Jon Snow interview 5 years ago, right? There's nothing you can do about it in this moment, except for just, you know, trying to calm down. So I've intellectualized it completely, but my body is doing its own thing. It's saying you need to run from this, because you never want to be back in that space again. And so my point, and what's really been fascinating hearing back from people who are now reading the book, is so many people coming back to me and saying, we have exactly the same traumatic response as you had. And you know, it's nice to hear from them, because you actually feel like you have a community who understand you now, that, you know, these things leave a marker, they leave a traumatic marker on us.
Thanks a lot for this. We're running short of time, so we open up to audience question. We have one from Suchitra, who asks, how do the brutalized build political power to resist, to leave and to rebuild communities? Which
Sure,
is partly following up on what you just talked about.
That's a great question. And, you know, I think the reason why I wanted to get the book together in the way that I did is to show that you can bring diversity of voices on specific issues, and show that there is a collective understanding of a single thing. I think sometimes what happens with our work of cooperating with one another, we end up in moralizing spaces with each other, which become a hindrance then to our cooperation on specific issues, right? So, you know, we all occupy different theological and ideological spaces that, you know, for our personal belief systems are extremely important. But what happens is that when we bring all of ourselves to every single issue, then fissures start to emerge. And that then in turn stops us from cooperating on specific things. And, you know, something that I wrote about in my last book, that when we as Muslims get stopped at the airport, the person stopping us has no idea which sect of Islam we're from. They are just pathologizing based on superficial markers of what they believe to be dangerous Muslimness, right? Which is to do with our names, it's to do with the way that we look, it's to do with the countries that we've flown back in from, right? All of these are all superficial. They've got nothing to do with threat assessment, and they've got nothing to do with what we internally believe inside our hearts, right? And so if we understand that that border stop is in and of itself a racist stop, okay, because it's about a pathology of dangerousness, then we have to coalesce around that issue together because we've identified that issue as being particularly problematic, okay? And that way, by taking on specific things like, for example, the ubiquity of condemnation culture, we can draw in wider voices, okay, even ones that may disagree on, you know, minutiae here and there, different things, different aspects of like our broader work. But on this one, we can come together and we can say, okay, this is how we take this on.
I want to ask you one last question that again comes from the book, and in particular the chapter that Nadia Ali wrote, which is um, it's very heartfelt because she wrote about that, particularly addressing her nieces and nephews, and she wrote something that she put it really beautifully and stayed with me, and she said that solidarity is a doing word. I would like you to comment on this because, as a, if we start from trauma and then we go towards resistance, then is solidarity the way, and how does that play out?
Sure, absolutely. I get questions so often from you know, people who are part of the predominant white society about how they can help end Islamophobia or racism, you know. And what I say to them is that, you know, those who are at least risk of harm from state violence have the greatest duty to place themselves between us and police batons. That's what solidarity looks like. That's what, yeah, I think Nadia Ali means as well when she talks about solidarity being a doing word. That, you know, when the expectation on the brutalized is to constantly protect themselves, that is not solidarity. And it's definitely not solidarity when liberals tell us that we have to be measured in our responses to these things. I remember a really funny conversation after this is before Charlie Hebdo. One of my colleagues, he wrote a satirical piece about the drone assassination of Barack Obama, kind of highlighting, you know, issues around sovereignty, around usage of drones and whatever, right? So it was a satirical piece. You know, satire is a very common tool that is useful to use in order to make political statements. I got a call from a friend at Amnesty International who was very senior, and she said to me, look, Asim, you need to take this piece down. It doesn't look good for us. You know, we're in coalition building around various issues. You know, it's not great. And I explained to her at the time how utterly ridiculous her request was, okay? But, you know, sometime later, it was actually a few years later, when Charlie Hebdo happened, like, she had like French flags all over her, you know, Facebook profile, you know, talking about how terrible it is that people are getting killed for satire and whatever. And like, you know, and this is the point that I want to make, that, you know, white allies often require us to be reasonable about our expectations. Actually, I think we have been a bit too reasonable in our expectation of our allies. We constantly say to ourselves, oh, well, we can't expect them to do X, Y, or Z because, you know, they're a big organization or they don't get these things. No, like, you guys, if you claim to defend human rights, if you claim to defend all of the things that you claim to defend, then you need to be on the front lines taking the hits. You need to be picketing. You need to be demonstrating. You need to be out there taking risks that people of color can't afford to do, because you will not be battered by the police like we will. You will not have excessive sentences placed on you like we will, right? And that's why your role is so much more important. And Dr. Sadia Habib, she writes beautifully in her essay, which she directs directly at her white liberal friend, and goes through exactly how this relationship between us and people who claim to be our allies takes place.
Fantastic. Thank you so, so much. It's been a very, very enriching discussion. And I encourage everyone to buy the book, because the book is really incredible and worth reading, but also to check out the work that Cage does, well, not only in the UK, but globally. Awesome. Thank you so much for having spent time with us and talked about the book.
Thank you. Thank you
and
too.
thanks everyone for joining us.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.